Join me as we skip to the end of a book. Not the ending of the story, but further in the back, almost by the back cover, the Acknowledgments. I've always been fascinated by the Acknowledgments and find myself asking questions I wish I had the answers to. Are the people they thanked still in their lives? Do they regret not including someone? What's the meaning behind this inside joke or story? Well, now I finally get the answers to my questions. In this podcast, I'll talk to the authors and explore the Acknowledgments. So flip to the back of the book with me and let's start there. So Sangu, I have 1 billion questions for you, so I'm gonna have to narrow them down. But what I'd love is just first, you have such an interesting history, at least I think it is, where you're civil engineer by education, but then also have an education in creative writing. So that's where I want to kind of start is like, how did that all happen? Those are two interesting pieces to put together.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, I think growing up, I always loved writing and the humanities, but I was geared towards a STEM career. I had gotten into the Cooper Union when I was in high school, which was a free school. So it was really hard to turn down a free education. And I would often say that's the reason I went there, but not the reason I stayed. And so I had a civil engineering connection in my family, and it's part of the book too, is my grandfather was a civil engineer who worked in Burma for the British before quitting to join the freedom movement in India. And my father grew up, he was the youngest of 13 children in this sort of like utopian experiment of sort of voluntary poverty, spinning your own cotton. My grandfather became a water diviner and was developing wells for the local villages. So I had heard this story, but I never met my grandfather, and he died when my dad was only 16. So it was a bit away. But there was always something about that too. If there's a little bit of a connection. And I was always interested in environmental issues. And so like my focus was leaning that way. And for a long time, I was like doing civil engineering, whether in school or in practice, but finding other avenues to work on like animal activism or writing. And yeah, it was just like a series of different events where in college, I read a book that set me off on a different journey. It was about chimpanzees who acquired American Sign Language. And I did a summer program there in Ellensburg, Washington. And that sort of opened my eyes to the ways chimps in the wild were being harmed. And after I got my first job out of grad school in engineering, I learned that there was a primate sanctuary in Cameroon that was looking for someone to help with like water supply issues. So that was like a way for me to try to apply some of my engineering to like my animal interests. And when I came back to the States after that, a couple of things happened. Like a year later, like my father passed away. And I also found this activist magazine in New York City called Satya, and which was just like a really wonderful like publication that combined sort of animal issues, environmental, social justice, made all the connections. And they had asked me to write about this Cameroon sanctuary. So I wrote my first article for them. And then a year later, I had quit my engineering job to join them. And then the publication was like a dream job, but it had closed a few years later. And at that time, I was trying to figuring out what I wanted to do. Do I want to do engineering? Do I want to do writing? And I ended up pursuing a creative writing MFA while working for the city of New York on water supply issues. So in some senses, it was like one thing led to another, and a lot of things were all the things happening at the same time. But I do think they're more related than not, the science and the writing, in terms of both being storytelling. And I was thinking about this recently, and maybe the difference is in like more technical stuff. There's like a precision of language of trying to convey like one particular meaning. And I think in my writing, I want to hold like all the meanings in the word. So I think there's like a little bit of a tension, but in terms of the big picture and the micro and how they both work together and how they're connecting a lot of different things, I think there are similarities between the work I did in engineering and writing, the differences too.
I think what's actually cool about that combination is also that it gives you the opportunity to take some of the things you're clearly passionate about, even as it relates to animals, that and put it in a way maybe that people can connect with more. So you're not just talking from a very scientific perspective, perhaps empathize and feel emotion in a different way. And sometimes that's the thing that makes someone get to that point where they're passionate about it and want to support a cause.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's interesting you talk about your grandfather as part of the freedom movement because my grandfather was as well.
Wonderful.
And so that's an interesting connection there. And I got to know him a little bit once he was much older from that. And it's funny when I think of my memories of him, it wasn't this tremendous man that was part of all of these such important movements and was imprisoned for his part in the freedom movement, but just as my grandfather, when
Yeah.
someone who had actually started I think it was actually maybe his uncle had started a library in the small village they lived in. And my grandfather was also a doctor and would take those that lived in poverty and not charge them and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just interesting that there's all these parts of people. And as a child, I didn't know that he was part of this tremendous movement because he had all these pieces to him.
Yeah.
The other part that's so interesting that you're talking about is I'm so fascinated is your work with the chimpanzees and within these rescues. What's something like if you had to kind of summarize like a thing that you took away from those experiences, what would it be?
It's one of the most extraordinary things I've ever done in terms of taking care of baby chimpanzees. It was like such an honor and a privilege, but it's also like the circumstances which brought them to me were really tragic. In Cameroon, oftentimes the bushmeat trade there, where chimpanzees are killed and sold as a delicacy product, is very much tied to deforestation and logging. And the baby chimpanzees who were in my care were orphaned. So it was really sort of tragic circumstances. But being able to care for them and to see them start to form new bonds who are going to be like their family for the rest of their lives was pretty remarkable. And just how they're processing the world. And each of them is like completely unique individual with their own preferences and needs. And seeing just, yeah, how their minds are working and processing is an honor. And like, I think also it's amazing to have the opportunity also to wanting to see them in the wild, live free in the wild, because as wonderful as so many sanctuaries are, I think they're still struggling with the fact that it's still a sense of captivity, and captivity is really hard. And the ones that I work for were really great in trying to give the best lives, but there is a long-term trauma that these animals experience. And so it's both wonderful to see them recover, but also it's not an easy road for most of them. Like us. Yeah.
It reminds me, I don't know if you've read The Penguin Year.
No.
So it's this gentleman that is a wildlife videographer, and he spent a year in the Arctic videoing and being there with the penguins. And it was kind of like, it reminds me of just this because I was like, oh my gosh, what an incredible experience for him. But then what I thought he was able to do so beautifully was also talk about it in terms of climate change and what's happening to the penguins and how they're living. And it was so educational in that way. It comes back to that, right? Because I felt like emotionally connected then to
Yeah.
it. I
Yeah.
think that's so important to tell those stories that like you're telling and that he was telling, because that's sometimes as close as someone like me is going to get to it. And speaking of animals, so tell me more about the Literary Animal Project.
Yeah, sure. So it just started, and it was a project. I got some funding from the Culture and Animals Foundation, and I'm hoping for it to be a sort of habitat to have these conversations that discuss sort of all the ways in which animal lives are portrayed on the page, and both like the ethics and the challenges of it. And so I really appreciated the examples you've said so far too. And these questions of like, how do we write about animals on the page to give them agency as well as invoke the reader to care. And how do we get the reader to hold these really heavy burdens in terms of what is happening to animals and all beings on the planet and come away with being guided by truth and compassion and not despair?
What are, like, when you think of more like long-term goals of this project, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, and right now I started a Substack newsletter. I'm hoping to have some conversations with different writers talking about different themes. I have a few maybe curated projects. I think there's something I want to do around like witnessing and exposition, both the ethics and the care around being witness to this. I've been in a very much a whale kick recently. Whales have been coming to me in all forms of media, and there's many tremendous books that I've read recently. Fathoms by Rebecca Giggs, Undrowned, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and a couple of short story by Swami. And there's a new poetry book, Whale Aria, coming out by Rajiv Mohabir. So I'm hoping to do something with that. I have this other project that I'm thinking about. I was reading a lot of Calvino, and he has his book Invisible Cities. And I've been thinking about invisible animal cities and all the ways we interact with animals in cities and trying to connect with different writings about urban animals in literature. But I'm hoping that whenever my book comes out and I go on tour, I can also use it as a thing to learn about the animals and the communities of people who care about the animals in all the places that I'm going. So there is this book, Experimental Animals by Talia Fields, and she wrote about these anti-vivisectionists in France. This one woman who was married to the father of vivisection, but she was an anti-vivisectionist. And the book draws so much from archival research, but the archival research is all about like the men in science. And she's telling the story of the women and the animal activists and the animals juxtaposed. But one of the things I remember clearly is basically the women were trying to save all the street animals from the vivisectors. So they divided like the streets of Paris and took territories to collect the strays and get them to safety. And so I just love thinking about that, even in the modern sense of I live in New York and I know a lot of activists in New York, and there's like the people, we have like our little phone tree of if someone finds someone like who goes to where. And just thinking of that, like in most places, there are people doing this kind of invisible work. So it's still in nascency, but there's like an invisible animal cities project that I want to be doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me a lot when my dog Layla is a rescue. And I think since that, like looking into rescues and all of that, what I just realized, like just thinking about invisible, that's how the people that are working within these rescues, I just feel like in a way they are invisible, like the tremendous work they're doing. And
Yeah.
not even just there, but the path even that a dog is taking, like Layla came from Texas, and that there were people that were like, I'm going to transport this dog, I'm going to rescue the mom, really, who was pregnant. And that's phenomenal. And just gave me an even bigger appreciation for what's going on. It's not just showing up at the rescue and here, I want this dog. There's so
Right.
much going into it. And people that are very often just volunteering and giving their time.
Yeah, I love that you're saying that too. And I think it ties to also my appreciation for acknowledgments, because the acknowledgments are really where you can highlight all this invisible labor that's required. I think that is like my deep attachment to reading acknowledgments too, and that I want to give back to that sort of, yeah. But yeah, I too have a rescue who came from Georgia, and she was shot in the face and dumped at a shelter. And then again, a group did a surgery, brought her up to New York, and there's so much involved in this. And yeah, it is unacknowledged.
Yes. And so thinking of the acknowledgments, which is how we got connected, because a mutual friend had read an article where you were featured through the New York Public Library talking about your research. And you have a chunk where you talk about, and I love this, I'm going to read it, where the question was, what's the most interesting thing you learned from a book recently? So you say, I love poring over acknowledgments as they lead me to other work and shed light on the invisible labors and friendships responsible for our knowledge. And then you talk about in the book, The Last Ape thanks his translator. And so then you ended up down that road. And what I loved and related to is that's how I sometimes describe it in a similar way of I'll just end up down this rabbit hole, sometimes because of the content of the book, of course, as well, then even about something that comes out of the acknowledgments. So I loved that you shared that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
tell me more about your experience with reading the acknowledgments.
I love acknowledgments, and as a reader, I often read them early and last. Like sometimes not first, sometimes first, but usually like maybe when I'm like 20 pages in and I'm really excited about something, I have to flip to the end because I might be curious of where they traveled or where some of the information came from. And it's a different experience also when you read it early because you don't know half the people in it, and then by the end, it's I look forward to it, especially if it's a good book having something more to read after the book is over. I'm comforting myself in the loss of the ending of a book by reading acknowledgments. So I enjoy them as a reader and as a researcher. Like when I'm researching my book, I had this magnificent fellowship at the New York Public Library, and I had a little room with shelves. I still have access to the room, and it's just the coolest thing. And but when I'm reading some of the more academic or scholarly works that I'm drawing from, sometimes the acknowledgments come first, so you're confronted with them right away. And I find that in some of the more academic texts, the acknowledgments are like just they're more personal, they tell the origin story, there's like the heart of it. And so I get way more out of reading them, like the acknowledgments and the introductions, than the text is fine and probably learn some things, but there's something like really beautiful at the heart of it, of the relationship of the author to the material and how they met or what the driving questions were. And oftentimes whoever they're talking about, like that person's book I'll look into, and like that's where I find most of the next steps of research is people and who they think. And then at some point, like I gather this mass, and I've been doing a lot recently trying to learn about ancient Tamil poetry. And then at one point, like all the books are talking to each other, like all the scholars. And so these names I had never heard of from before, but now they're like a family on my shelf and they're all talking to each other. And I love that too.
Oh, I love that. And what's motivated this look into this Tamil poetry?
My family's from Tamil Nadu, and my grandfather's ashram in Kalakurchi, where my grandfather grew up, was there. And so I first wanted to just like try to relearn Tamil. I was born here, but I spent a couple of years when I was a baby in India. My mom went back to do a social work master's there. So my first language was Tamil, and then I came back here and it was pretty much displaced. But I thought it would be helpful, like just to have it in my subconscious while I was writing. And then I found a bunch of different things that led me to the Tamil poets. So I was taking Zoom lessons with my Tamil tutor, and I've had a couple of just good mentors in different fields. Another friend had sent an excerpt of my book to her father, who reached out to me to offer dowsing lessons, water divining lessons. And so we had started, and he had also asked me about Tamil poetry. I was telling him my interest. And I have another section of my book, which comes from time I was in Rwanda, and I had a excerpt that was in Kinyarwandan that I needed to get translated. And it was in a journal that I carried around since 2005 that I just got translated. And my translator was also telling me about the similarities between Indian languages and African languages, and a book that blew his mind about the philosophies that I requested on my shelf in the lab. And it all was like making sense too, because they all were pointing to these early mythologies of like a lost continent between India and Africa, and Kumari Kandam, and or it was like Lemuria, where the lemurs had a little bridge. But so I think it was just all roads were leading me to this place. But then when I started getting into the poetry, what really excited me was a lot of the philosophy that I'm still learning, But it seems as though like there's such a connection to the natural world, and it's not like a separate thing. And a lot of the things that we talk about now about like climate literature or ecofiction or things like that, like they were doing this 2000 years ago, or what we think about in science about studying grief in animals and acknowledging they have feelings, that these poets from way back in the day were able to capture the sort of emotional lives of animals and how they responded to drought and rain and fear and being caught in a net. And so I felt like they're like these early forebears in this sort of animal rights literature, some of them, not all of them, but and that there is like there was an ecological grammar that it was divided into these different landscapes, and they paid such close attention to like when things happen, time of day and time of year, and any tree is united is like with whoever lives in that tree. And so there's something about that, and I think about that in our modern sense of like how we don't understand this grammar anymore, and or we have this new grammar that might be more vulgar.
Yeah.
That so I don't know. It was just really helpful, and I think the poems are divided into these two categories, which is called agam and puram, like inness and outness, or but I think they did both, and I'm interested in both, like that sort of inner world and the outer world and how we're reconciling with both. So I think they were giving me language for things I'm thinking about now with inner and outer grief and this connection to this landscape. So I don't know, I've been fascinated, but I'm reading all the commentaries in English. My Tamil tutoring is very basic, and I'm still like 2-year-old Sangu, but I'm trying to have the sophisticated literary scholarship as well.
I think what's really cool about what you've done, and I'm even like considering for myself now, like how am I doing this or am I not taking the opportunity to, is you've taken all of these like facets of your life, like your interest in animal welfare and your civil engineering and your writing and your background, your heritage and your family, and pulled it all together for one path, which is just so cool. I think that's just so interesting that you've been able to do that and take it in all these different directions.
I think like writing this book has been a way to incorporate all the different parts of me. And I think it's taken me a while to realize that too, because I think I had different hats and I'd be a certain person and then I'd be a different person. And I think it can be kind of liberating to be like, how do I bring all of the parts? So I think the past year I was working for on our city's water supply for many years, and I quit last year to really devote to this book. And then when I did, I just had all of these things. My friend Leslie will always quote Rumi back to me of what you seek seeks you. So it doesn't really, like with the Tamil Sangam poets, even if I'm translating Kinyarwanda and like it's getting me there, like whatever I'm doing gets me there. And so I've just been able to really take note of it and accept it. Because I think so much of my path is, I think with the science background, when you're doing experiments or whatever, like the key is so it could be like replicated. Your process is simple, then, and then none of what I'm doing is replicable. Like it's always like random, like whatever book I pulled out on the shelf that I happened to stumble upon has led me a certain way. And maybe I would have gone a different way somewhere else, or maybe I would still get there, but it would be a different journey. But I think just accepting it and when you're I think I'm just trying to pay attention to and be grateful for the sort of like feeling of like serendipity that coming. Although, like another friend also was saying, to not discount the labor involved for that serendipity. So
I think it comes with making space for it, which
yeah,
sounds like you did.
yeah.
So I would love to hear about the book. So governing bodies, tell me about it. I'd love for you to read a part of it. Tell me when it's going to come out, all of it.
Great, thank you. So I've been calling this book Governing Bodies Katina, which was a word I learned from a subtitle from one of the books on my shelf at the library. It was a book that was a vegetarian history anthology of vegetarian thought, The Ethics of Diet. It was called A Katina of Authorities Deprecatory of the Practice of Flesh Eating. But the word katina is a chain of linked texts. And in soil science, it's a series of soil layers down a slope that each are distinct but connected. And when I saw that word, it was also something that sort of triggered if I have all of these sort of disparate things. And I know in my heart of hearts that they're all connected, but they're also, they're not the same. So it's like I'm doing all this work where I am uncovering a lot of variations of themes, and they're similar, they're different, but they're connected. And so that was a helpful frame. The book, I think the origin story really is when I lost my father in 2003. I was realizing all the things that sort of were lost in that process in terms of his like learning more about him, which was so much tied to his childhood, and then this grandfather that I never met. So those were my earlier curiosities, but at that time, I wasn't thinking about a book at all. I was just, these were the things I was obsessing about. And at the same time, I was trying to figure out how to do more animal stuff or just to align my professional life with my ethical beliefs. And so all those things were happening at the same time. So this book, I call it Governing Bodies, which is like a lyrical reckoning of how bodies, both human, water, animal, are controlled and liberated. And right now it's set into these three parts. And I worked on the middle last year when I quit. Like I had different things and I was writing into this gap, and I ended up writing this letter to my father. That's like 100 pages. And I didn't know if I was going to be able to sustain the epistolary form for that long, but I really loved it because I was able to also, when I was doing all this research about India and Tamil literature and Kalakurchi, I didn't want to have this very pedantic scholarly voice. And like I'm just coming from it from like someone who's just learning and processing it. So I just wanted someone to process things with. Yeah. And I didn't want it to be this explanatory, let me explain India to you, or I have to explain a lot of things that I think take away from the craft or like the poetic voice. And then I realized like maybe my first part, which I'm going to read from now, right now it's just written. I think it might be shaped towards orienting towards my grandfather. And the third part, which I think is focused on my life in the last 10 years or so. And I might be orienting it towards a future me. But I think those might just be helpful for me to get it down. I'm not sure if they're going to stay in the letter form there, but I am attached to it in the middle. I also, because just for the past 10 years or so, it's hard to know what to do on like death anniversaries but I started to do this letter writing process, which isn't the letter that's in the book, but stems from a lot of the things I've been thinking about. But so I just felt like it was very organic for me because I did have a letter writing process already to my father. And it was something it was just something I felt good about doing. And his birthday and death day are so close. So it was just like a good, like a thing I like to do. But so, yeah, I think as you said before, like I'm trying to combine all these aspects of my life in this book. And it is being published by Milkweed Editions. I don't have a publication date left. I'm still working through another draft. And then the way these things go, it's like a year from then is when it'll be out. So likely 2025, but I've been enjoying the process. So do you want me to read I can read a little bit.
I would love that.
Great. So I open with this. What you must understand is that when I tell you a story about my body, I cannot separate it from a story about water. And a story about water is also a story about family. And a story about family is rooted in the earth. And when I tell you about the earth, I must tell you about elephants and chimpanzees, cows and chickens, coral and trees. What harms one body harms all bodies. Like tributaries to the same river, our stories are entwined. The Irrawaddy River in Burma is named after the mythical multi-trunked white elephant Airavata, whose name is derived from the Sanskrit word Iravat, one who is produced from water. My family history is a story produced from water. If I were to trace my grandfather's engineering career, I'd follow it down the Irrawaddy River. If I were to trace mine, I'd follow it from the streams in the Catskill Mountains, through aqueducts and tunnels, to New York City's pipes and faucets. My experience is also in the Yosemite Valley, Sierra Nevada snowmelt that gravity carries to San Francisco. It is on rooftops and in rain barrels in Cameroon. in buckets in the Sanaga River. These lines of Alfred Lord Tennyson were passed down in my family from my grandfather to my father to me. And out again I curve and flow to join the brimming river, for men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. Tata, my paternal grandfather, worked for the British in Burma before moving his family back to southern India in the 1930s to pursue a life of activism in the Tamil Nadu town of Kalakurchi. This was my grandfather's attempt to practice nonviolence while the society around him was teeming with oppression from both colonialism and the caste system. Tata traded in his civil engineering post and became a water diviner to develop wells for communities previously denied access to water. Water and sanitation were closely linked to social justice. My father, the youngest of Tata's 13 children, was born into this utopian experiment in Kalakurchi. Revolution began by learning to spin. The children all wore homespun khadi clothes. Education was learning the landscape, climbing trees, drawing water, and reciting poetry. My father grew up studying Sanskrit and English in addition to speaking Tamil at home. Each day he copied a page of the dictionary by hand and memorized Shakespeare, Tennyson, Goldsmith, and others from a poetry collection Tata gave to him. My father gave me this worn copy of memory work and appreciation so that I too could recite the same poems by heart. This book of British verse was the only physical artifact passed on between our 3 generations. I have never met my grandfather, but found it curious that Tata, who quit the British in Burma to join the freedom movement in India, showered his children with the oppressor's literature. But I later realized that relationships are complicated, and perhaps non-cooperation need not apply to poetry. When I was 25 years old, I recited those lines of Tennyson to my father at Good Samaritan Hospital in New York, where I was born. I didn't know he was going to die or if he heard me. My father left the world in the same place I entered it. Thank you.
Oh, it's really beautiful.
Thank you.
Like a few things came to mind, like hearing the beginning part about the connections to water and all. You know what? I went on a webinar once and they were how you can be happy. Which is such an odd topic, I realized. But one of the things was about living in a state of wonder. And I loved the concept of it because it was like you get pulled into the everyday of just life, but then coming out of that sometimes and just being like, look at this world around me and being in this part of the whole world and the connection around everything. So that's what that reminds me of. And I love how you're talking about relationships. And I realize this is an audio thing, but I know you can see me getting teary. So you talking about reading to your father in the hospital, it just was powerful for me because I lost a friend recently. And the last time I saw her was in the hospital. And reading and words were such a big part of our relationship. And that was what I did too. I took a book, the Paris Bookshop, I believe it's called, and I started reading from that and have the same hope that she heard me reading to her as well. So that's meaningful to me that those words were also something that connected you and your father and your grandfather, actually, in this case.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. It's so beautiful and meaningful for me to hear too.
And when you're talking about writing this letter, I was thinking actually her birthday is actually coming up and you were talking about what to do around those time frames that are significant. And I think that's such a lovely way to communicate my thoughts, even if they're just a letter to her that no one ever sees. So thank you for that.
No, it's felt really like wonderful to do. And the letters I would just write them and not look at them. Like I wasn't looking to publish them in that sort of way. And then this year on my dad's anniversary, I was trying to figure out what to do because I have like this 100-page letter and my friend told me about this app called Speechify, which you can listen to your text in different voices. So there's like a Snoop Dogg and a Gwyneth Paltrow voice. And there's like an Obama-like voice. It's called Mr. President. But there is a woman who can read it in like a Tamil voice.
Yeah.
I listened to my letter, like on my dad's birthday anniversary. It was like I went to Roosevelt Island because I wanted to be around water and I wanted to just spend time with this. And so just laid down on Roosevelt Island and listened to this middle part of my book. And
wow, I love And I just love that you've compiled so much over the years of those letters to him.
Yeah.
Okay, so I need to know if they're not there yet, or will there be acknowledgments in
Oh,
this?
of course.
Okay, so
Um,
then mark your calendar for 2022 about all those. Have you already written?
Again, since I've been working on this for a really long time, and so sometimes I'll just go into a dump. Like I use like Scrivener as my writing tool, and so I think in it various Scriveners I have some working acknowledgments of just trying to, remember because when you work on it for so long, there's so many people along the way. But I'm thinking about like how to organize them, whether it's like chronology, thematically, and I want them to be like little mini stories too. I had a writing mentor, Louise DeSalvo, and she talked about how often writing is thought of as this like solitary and solipsistic act, and how we must write about the creative process as it occurs, as it is nurtured between loving friends. And I don't know, I feel like I might use that in my acknowledgments, like have these other meta acknowledgments of just like practicing that. And I feel, as I said before, acknowledgments is acknowledging all this invisible labor. And I think trying to amass stories that are largely gone or erased and coming across all these other, even like the Tamil poets, it's remarkable that we have anything left of them. And so there's all these invisible labors that led to them being on my library shelf. And yeah, it is its own like philosophical thing that I'm trying to figure out like how I wanted to say it adequately, which I don't know.
I think especially for you, because of the impact acknowledgments have been for you, I can imagine that adds to maybe your own challenge of how to best acknowledge and show your gratefulness to those that supported this for you. And then also just as you said, those the invisible parts of it.
Yeah. And
It's
I
interesting.
guess,
One of the
oh,
oh, go ahead.
I have another acknowledgement story is my book is being published by Milkweed Editions, and I had the
Mhm.
backwards approach to getting a book contract where normally you get an agent and then they shop it around. And I think it was really hard for a book like mine to no one knew what to do with it. And they're like, it's too much going on in here. And can you just focus on this? And that approach is harder. And it happened the other way where a friend had nominated me for this Aspen Emerging Writers Fellowship. And one of the judges was an editor at Milkweed who read like 10 pages. And she reached out to me. And it was like the kindest letter because she was like, I love how you're pulling in all the things and you have the family and the water and the animals. And like she loved all the things and wanted more of all the things, where everyone else was like wanting to be me to be smaller. And so that felt really good. And I was then like Googling her, and then she was like, I think would be a good fit. And I was Googling her, and then I just Googled all the acknowledgments of like how people wrote about her. And there's another writer who wrote about her, Elizabeth Rush, with Book Rising, and I can just read
Yes.
her thing, which also just made me feel like this is who I want to work with. Finally, my deepest thanks to Joey McGarvey, my exacting editor. Always, you ask the toughest questions, the ones that made Rising into something well wrought. And when I thought these sentences were complete, you return to them again, generously and with attention, like a squeeze of lemon juice in your soup. Your wisdom and wordsmithing are what make this book shine. And I just loved, like, she's filled with people acknowledging, talk about invisible labor. So that was like reading acknowledgments was also part of finding my publishing house.
I love it. I love that too, because in articles I've read about writing in the acknowledgments who maybe don't feel as strongly about the impact of them, or everyone's just going through and always saying thank you to their publisher, editor, or such, just as they have to. But what I
Yeah.
love about that is it was so real. Like it
Yeah.
does actually show the impact and connection between a writer and their editor and their publisher and all of that. So I love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And yeah, it's more than just like the pro forma thing. And that's what I just
Yeah.
thought. People would just write paragraphs to her. And
And so what, I don't know if you're reading Rising right now, but what's on your next read, or what are you currently reading right now? What do you like to read?
sure, I'm reading a couple of things for the Literary Animal Project. I just went to a virtual book talk about this book, The Creative Lives of Animals by
Oh,
Carol
okay.
Gigliotti.
Yeah.
There's also another woman. This book is an academic book by Duke Press Indifference
Yeah.
by Nesarge Dave. I had interviewed her a few years ago, At that time, she had written a book about queer activism in India and was working on a book about animal activism in India. And this is that book. And so I'm excited to read this. And also in the context of just the harsh political realities of modern India and how to be an activist and divorce yourself from separate from the Hindu national politics of it.
Yeah.
It's very nuanced and interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things on your list. It's interesting because as I'm like looking at my books over here, and I feel like now I actually want this to maybe go higher up. Have you read So I had started listening to it a while ago, but I think I'm going to actually read it. And what I just think is interesting is like the remarkable story of New York by following the trajectory of one of its most fascinating inhabitants, the oyster. And I think also just talks about the environmental impact to the oysters through like this showing the history of New York. So I
Wow.
feel like that might be right up your alley as well.
Totally right up my alley. And I'm in the process of potentially returning back to work in the city. I was working on a water supply, and now I'll be working on these stormwater blue belts, these nature-based solutions to handling stormwater and creating habitats. But yeah, I think I'm excited to read more about oysters and just the ways
Yeah.
nature does the best work. More,
Yeah.
this does the best water purification. Then yeah.
And I will say, so I just checked, it does have acknowledgments.
Okay,
And
good.
of course, I try not to read. And it's funny because you were saying you read them sometimes at the beginning. And
Yeah.
I would always be like, I'm going to leave it to the end. It's like my treat or my prize at the
Yeah.
end. But I find it harder and harder to do. And it's just very cute because he's talking about lots of love to Marion and about how they're happy as oysters. No
Oh.
reason to think, no reason to think clams are any happier just because they don't make attachments and can hop on one foot.
Yeah, and I was sharing with you like the sewer book that I was reading. They were also doing sewer references in Jessica Lee Hester's book,
Yeah.
talking about fatbergs and making a comparison to the resilience of another relationship in her acknowledgement.
I love it. I love it. And another book I was just thinking of as you were talking. Oh, there it is. It's so funny you're talking about it. True Biz. So unrelated to animals per se. So I actually did finish reading it. It's fiction, but it's talking about the students at a deaf school. And
Mm.
what I thought was just really interesting is throughout, though, even though it was fiction, was so educational in the deaf community in ASL, which you were
Mm.
talking in terms of
Yeah.
communicating with animals and such as well.
Yeah.
Reading a book and reading the acknowledgments once like promotes as taking deep dives into other subjects and this really hard topics around how deaf schools have closed and how it's not supporting the children and adults and the deaf community. So very interesting that way as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out. I had read a book many years ago. It was called Train Go Sorry, and it was about the Lexington School for the Deaf here in New York and some
Yeah.
of those debates about deaf education a long time
Yep.
ago. And so it'd be interesting to hear it in this
Yes.
too. I love your reading. Just this podcast premise is like wonderful, but I just love the wide array of books that you're bringing to it. So it's exciting for me too.
And it's funny you say that because that's probably been one of the unexpected joys of doing this podcast is when I get a message from someone that says, I would have never read that genre or that kind of book, but I got to hear the author talk about it and it made me curious and I wanted to read it. And I love that because I feel like a lot of people just feel like, oh, this is my genre. This is what I read. I can't read other things. But sometimes I think just hearing the author talk about it and their experience changes the way someone might look at it and give it a chance. And I think that's such a powerful thing. Like the more different kinds of things we read, I think just opens up our perspectives to everything in the world.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for getting curious about the acknowledgments, and remember to read from cover to cover. Check out the acknowledgments on Facebook, Instagram, or theacknowledgments.com. There you'll find more information on the books and authors that I talk about here.